Some families hide secrets behind locked doors. Others bury them in official records that never existed. In the shadows of forgotten towns and missing paperwork, there are stories so unsettling that history itself seems to look away. Tonight's story is not about ghosts or demons, but about children who officially never lived, and a family whose kindness may have masked something far darker. The Follings were never loud about their generosity, and that was precisely what made it convincing. In a time when public charity was often performed loudly through church announcements and newspaper praise, their quiet willingness to take children into their home seemed almost noble. They did not petition authorities, did not request financial support, and did not seek recognition. They simply accepted children when others could not or would not. This silence created an illusion of trust. People assumed that those who asked for nothing must be hiding nothing. And in an era shaped by poverty, war, aftermaths, and overcrowded orphanages, a family willing to shoulder the burden of extra mouths was rarely questioned. Neighbors recalled that the children arrived individually, never in groups, often late in the evening or early before dawn. There were no wagons marked by institutions, no clergy escorting the arrivals, no paperwork exchanged at the door. Sometimes the children were brought by distant relatives who left quickly. Sometimes they appeared with the Follings themselves after short trips away from town. When asked casually where the children came from, the answers were vague but disarming. Orphans from another county, a cousin who had died, a child whose mother could no longer cope. These explanations were common enough to discourage suspicion, especially in a society accustomed to loss. The Follings themselves fit the image of respectability. They attended church, though irregularly. They paid their debts on time. Their home was modest but well kept, with a fenced yard and curtained windows that suggested privacy rather than secrecy. The husband was known as soft-spoken, almost forgettable, while his wife carried a calm authority that reassured others. She spoke gently of children as blessings and burdens alike, using language that mirrored sermons of the time. No one thought to ask why a couple with no visible wealth kept expanding their household without external assistance. Local officials were disinclined to interfere. Record-keeping in rural districts was inconsistent, and adoption laws were loosely enforced at best. Many children lived with families without formal arrangements, especially when churches or neighbors acted as intermediaries. The absence of birth certificates was not immediately alarming because so many births went unregistered, particularly among the poor, migrants, or those living far from hospitals. The Follings understood this gap perfectly. They operated within the gray areas of legality, never directly violating laws but never fully complying with them either. School teachers noticed irregularities but dismissed them. Some of the children attended briefly and then stopped. Others never enrolled at all. When questioned, the Follings explained that certain children were sickly, slow learners, or better suited for home instruction. In an era when compulsory education was inconsistently enforced, such explanations were accepted. Teachers assumed poverty or illness, not deliberate concealment. The children themselves were described as unusually quiet, rarely volunteering information about their pasts, as if they had been coached to forget it or had never been allowed to form it in the first place. What made the situation even more unsettling in retrospect was how effectively the Follings blended into community life while remaining emotionally distant. They participated in seasonal events but rarely hosted gatherings. No one entered the deeper parts of their home. Visitors remained in the front rooms where order and cleanliness projected stability. The children were seldom present during these visits, and when they were, they kept their eyes lowered and spoke only when addressed. This behavior was interpreted as discipline, not fear. Whispers did circulate, but they were fragile and easily dismissed. A child seen crying alone in the yard at night, another rumored to have been sent away suddenly, a name remembered by one neighbor but forgotten by another. These fragments never formed a coherent accusation. The Follings were careful never to let concern accumulate. Time passed, memories faded, and new arrivals replaced old questions. In small communities, familiarity often replaces scrutiny, and the Follings benefited from that tendency fully. The most disturbing aspect was how little resistance they encountered. Churches did not demand baptismal records. Doctors treated children without asking where they were born. Census takers wrote down approximate ages supplied by the Follings themselves. Every institution trusted the family's word because challenging it would have required effort, confrontation, and responsibility that no one was eager to assume. The children existed socially but not legally, present in daily life. yet absent from official memory. Years later, when attempts were made to reconstruct the family's history, this lack of questioning became impossible to ignore. There were no adoption papers because none had ever been filed. There were no objections because none had ever been raised strongly enough. The Follings did not need to hide aggressively. They simply relied on the comfort of indifference. Their greatest shield was the assumption that nothing so strange could exist in plain sight. A family without questions was far more dangerous than one surrounded by suspicion, because silence allowed patterns to repeat without interruption, and each unasked question made the next one easier to avoid. The absence of identity was the most unsettling thread running through the lives of the children who entered the Follings household. Names were given to them, but names alone were never enough to anchor a person to reality. There were no birth dates anyone could verify, only rough estimates offered by the Follings themselves. Ages shifted subtly over the years, changing depending on who asked and why it mattered. A child who was said to be 9 one year might be described as 11 the next, not because time had passed, but because accuracy had never existed in the first place. Without documents, identity became flexible, almost disposable. In that era, birth certificates were already unevenly recorded, especially for children born outside hospitals or to families living on the margins. The Follings exploited this weakness with precision. They understood that the absence of a record did not immediately suggest fraud, only poverty or misfortune. Each child arrived with a story that could not be verified and therefore could not be disproven. Parents lost to illness, mothers who vanished, fathers whose names were never known. These explanations dissolved responsibility while inviting sympathy, creating a protective fog around the children's origins. What made this lack of identity especially disturbing was how thoroughly it erased the children's pasts. Without documents, there was no way to trace lineage, inheritance, or even medical history. Doctors treating illnesses had no information beyond what the Follings chose to provide. Priests performing blessings or funerary rites relied solely on spoken names and guessed ages. Census records listed the children as members of the household, but these entries were transient, vanishing as soon as a child stopped appearing in the home. It created the illusion of existence without permanence, like shadows passing through official records and then disappearing. The children themselves appeared to internalize this erasure. Those who were old enough to speak often avoided discussing their early lives, not with fear or trauma that observers could easily recognize, but with an unsettling blankness. Some seemed genuinely unsure of where they had come from. Others gave conflicting accounts that changed over time, as though repetition had overwritten memory. Identity is often shaped by being remembered by others, and these children were remembered only as long as they were useful, visible, or present. School enrollment exposed the problem briefly before it was concealed again. Forms requiring parental names, birth locations, and previous residences were either left incomplete or filled with vague answers. In some cases, children were enrolled under different surnames, only to be withdrawn weeks later. Teachers noticed inconsistencies but rarely pursued them. Without a centralized system to flag missing records, each institution encountered only a fragment of the truth. No single authority ever saw the full pattern, allowing the absence of identity to persist unchallenged. The lack of birth certificates also meant the children had no legal age. This detail mattered more than it seemed. Without proof of age, there were no clear boundaries around labor, education, or consent. A child could be claimed to be older when work was required, and younger when responsibility needed to be avoided. Time became something that could be manipulated. Childhood could be shortened or extended at will, depending entirely on the needs of the household rather than the welfare of the child. Church records, often a secondary source of identity during that period, offered no clarity. Baptisms were delayed, sometimes never performed at all. When they did occur, the entries were sparse, lacking parentage or place of birth. In some instances, children attended church for years without ever being formally recorded as members. This omission cut them off from one of the few systems that might have preserved their existence beyond the household. Without baptismal records, marriages and burials later in life would also become uncertain, compounding the erasure across generations. The most chilling consequence of this absence was how easily a child could disappear. If a child left the household, intentionally or otherwise, there was no paperwork to trigger concern, no missing persons reports, no school files to prompt inquiry, no hospital records to raise alarms. A child could vanish and leave behind no trace except unreliable memories. Over time, even those memories faded, softened by uncertainty and the discomfort of doubt. Neighbors later struggled to recall how many children had lived there at any given time. Faces blurred together, names were forgotten or confused. The lack of identity extended beyond documents and into collective memory itself. When people attempted to recount the past, they realized they had never truly known who those children were. They had existed only in relation to the Follings, never as individuals with histories of their own. This systematic absence of identity raises questions that history cannot answer cleanly. Whether the children were born into invisibility or stripped of identity upon arrival matters less than the result. They lived without proof that they had ever been born and without assurance that they would ever be remembered. In a world increasingly defined by records and recognition, the Follings children occupied a terrifying space between presence and non-existence, where a human life could unfold entirely outside the boundaries of official reality, sustained only by silence, assumptions, and the willingness of others not to look too closely. The disappearances did not happen all at once, and that was part of what made them so difficult to grasp. There was no single moment when the household suddenly felt empty or alarmingly quiet. Instead, the children faded from view gradually, one absence blending into the next until no one could say with certainty who was missing or when they had last been seen. A child who once stood near the fence watching passers-by would simply no longer be there weeks later. Another who had been mentioned casually in conversation would never come up again. The rhythm of daily life absorbed these gaps without protest. The Follings always had explanations ready, and they were delivered calmly, without defensiveness. A child had been sent to live with relatives, another had been placed in service elsewhere. One was too sickly and had been moved to receive care. In a period when families frequently shifted children between households for work or survival, these explanations sounded ordinary. What stood out only later was how final they were. No return visits were mentioned, no letters were received, no follow-up stories emerged. The children did not exist elsewhere in the community after they left the Follings' home. Those who tried to recall specific details found their memories frustratingly incomplete. They remembered the feeling of unease more clearly than facts. A neighbor might recall that there were once more children at the table, but not their names. Another remembered hearing laughter that later stopped, but could not say which child had laughed. Memory without documentation proved fragile, especially when challenged by the quiet confidence of the adults involved. The Follings never contradicted one another, never hesitated, never offered unnecessary detail that could be examined too closely. Some children disappeared between census years, leaving gaps in official records that looked like clerical errors rather than human losses. A name present in one census simply failed to appear in the next. Ages did not line up. Numbers fluctuated. Census takers relied on what they were told, and the Follings controlled that narrative entirely. Once a child was no longer listed, there was no mechanism to ask why. The absence became permanent with the stroke of a pen. School records showed similar vanishing acts. Attendance stopped abruptly. Teachers marked prolonged absences, then closed files when explanations were offered. In some cases, the records themselves were lost or destroyed over time, further erasing any trace of the children's existence. Without birth certificates, there was nothing to cross-reference, nothing to suggest that a missing student should be sought out. The system was not designed to protect children who had never officially entered it. Within the home, routines adjusted smoothly. Fewer beds were needed. Meals were prepared for smaller numbers. Clothing that once hung on lines or hooks was no longer seen. Yet no one noticed these changes closely enough to question them. People see what they expect to see, and the Follings had established a pattern of constant change. Children arrived, children left. Movement itself became normal, masking the permanence of disappearance. Rumors did surface, but they lacked focus. Someone claimed a child had died, though no burial was recalled. Another suggested one had run away, though no search had occurred. These stories contradicted one another, cancelling out their urgency. Without shared certainty, concern dissolved into speculation. The truth, whatever it was, remained suspended in ambiguity, protected by the absence of evidence. The children who remained seemed aware of the disappearances, though they never spoke of them directly. Their behavior changed subtly after each absence. They grew quieter, more compliant, more cautious. They avoided eye contact with outsiders. They stayed close to the house. Observers later described an atmosphere of restraint, as though the children had learned that visibility carried risk. Silence became a survival instinct. What makes these disappearances especially unsettling is how little disruption they caused. No authorities arrived, no investigations followed, no headlines appeared. Life continued uninterrupted, both inside and outside the household. The children who vanished did not trigger grief rituals, public concern, or official response. They simply ceased to occupy space in the world that others could see. Years later, attempts to trace the missing children led nowhere. There were no graves to visit, no marriage records to uncover, no employment histories to follow. The trail ended at the doorstep of the Follings home. Beyond that point, history offered nothing but silence. It was as if the children had stepped off the edge of recorded existence. The most disturbing realization came from those who lived nearby for decades and still could not say how many children had disappeared in total. Estimates varied, memories conflicted. Some insisted it was only a few, others believed it was many more. The uncertainty itself became part of the horror. When human lives can vanish without consensus, it reveals how easily reality can be shaped by neglect and convenience. The Follings never appeared burdened by these losses. They did not mourn publicly. They did not speak nostalgically. Their household continued to function, orderly and controlled, as if absence was an expected outcome rather than a tragedy. Whatever happened to the children, it happened quietly, shielded by social norms, institutional gaps, and the collective reluctance to confront uncomfortable questions, allowing disappearance to become not an event, but a process that unfolded slowly, invisibly, and without resistance. The era in which the Follings lived was uniquely suited to silence, a time when authority was fragmented and responsibility could be easily redirected. Laws existed, but enforcement depended heavily on local interpretation, personal judgment, and the willingness of individuals to involve themselves in matters that felt uncomfortable or inconvenient. This created a landscape where neglect did not need to be intentional to be effective, it only needed to be consistent. The Follings understood this environment intuitively, moving through it without friction, relying on the fact that no single institution felt fully responsible for the welfare of children who arrived without documentation. Local governments operated with limited resources and even more limited coordination. Records were kept by hand, stored in offices vulnerable to fire, flood, and simple misplacement. A missing file did not trigger alarm. It was expected. When adoption laws were discussed, they were framed more as moral guidance than enforceable mandate. Informal placements were common, particularly among families who presented themselves as respectable. The Follings never challenged authority directly, but they never invited scrutiny either, existing comfortably in the space between oversight and indifference. Churches played a powerful social role, yet they too were constrained by tradition and trust. Clergy relied on parishioners to provide truthful information, and questioning a family's account of a child's origins was seen as intrusive or uncharitable. Without baptismal records or formal requests for aid, there was little incentive for churches to intervene. Children attended services, sat quietly, and left without incident. Their presence validated the Follings' image as caretakers, while their absence later raised no doctrinal concern. Faith filled gaps where verification should have existed. Medical institutions were similarly limited. Doctors treated whoever appeared at their doors, often paid in cash or goods, and rarely recorded detailed personal histories. A child's name and approximate age were enough. There was no centralized health system to track patient continuity, no obligation to question guardianship unless abuse was obvious. Even then, intervention was rare. Illnesses were common. Injuries were explained away as accidents. Without legal identity, the children were medically present but administratively invisible. Schools, often considered the first line of social oversight, were ill-equipped to notice patterns beyond their own classrooms. Attendance laws were unevenly enforced, and families frequently withdrew children for labor, illness, or relocation. When a child stopped attending, teachers recorded the absence and moved on. They were not investigators. They did not have the authority or support to challenge a family's explanations. The disappearance of a student became a clerical matter rather than a human one. Law enforcement, where it existed, focused on crimes that disrupted public order. Missing children from private households did not fit neatly into that category, especially when no complaint was filed. Without parents demanding answers or institutions raising alarms, there was no catalyst for action. The assumption was that families knew their own affairs best. This assumption shielded the Follings from inquiry, even as children vanished under their roof. Census operations, often viewed as comprehensive records, were anything but. Enumerators worked quickly, relying on self-reported information. They had no means to verify ages, names, or relationships. If the Follings listed fewer children one year than the last, it was noted without comment. Population movement was common. Deaths, relocations, and household changes were expected. The census captured moments, not truths, and those moments were shaped entirely by what households chose to reveal. What binds all these institutions together is not malice, but fragmentation. Each system saw only a piece of the picture and assumed another would notice if something was wrong. Churches assumed schools would report concerns. Schools assumed families were acting lawfully. Doctors assumed children were legitimate dependents. Law enforcement assumed absence of complaint meant absence of crime. In this web of assumptions, children without identity slipped through every opening. The Follings did not need influence or power to maintain this silence. They only needed predictability. By behaving consistently and avoiding extremes, they never triggered the thresholds that demanded intervention. There were no public outbursts, no visible cruelty, no scandals that forced attention. Normalcy became their strongest defense, reinforced by institutions that prioritized order over inquiry. Over time, this institutional silence transformed into collective amnesia. Records that might have raised questions were never created. Concerns that might have grown were never shared across systems. Each missed opportunity compounded the next. By the time anyone attempted to reconstruct what had happened, the trail had gone cold, not because evidence had been destroyed, but because it had never been gathered. This history reveals how easily harm can exist within the boundaries of legality when laws are loosely enforced and responsibility is diffuse. The children did not fall through cracks accidentally. The cracks were wide, familiar, and accepted as part of the social structure. The Follings simply walked their children through them, confident that no single authority would stop them, because no single authority believed it was their place to ask, leaving the truth suspended in a space where silence was mistaken for order and inaction was interpreted as peace. What remained after the Follings were gone was not a clear record of wrongdoing, nor a definitive account of innocence, but a lingering uncertainty that refused to settle into any single explanation. The house eventually changed hands, its walls repainted, its rooms repurposed, yet the questions attached to it did not fade as easily. People spoke of the family in fragments, each recollection incomplete, shaped more by unease than evidence. The lack of resolution became its own inheritance, passed quietly from one generation to the next, leaving behind a story that could not be closed. Attempts to reconstruct the lives of the children met the same obstacles repeatedly. Historians searched courthouse archives and found nothing. Church registries offered only partial names, sometimes misspelled, sometimes duplicated. Census rolls contradicted one another. The paper trail dissolved under scrutiny, revealing how little substance it had ever possessed. Without birth certificates, there was no beginning. Without death records, there was no end. The children existed only in the unstable space between memory and rumor, their lives unanchored from any official timeline. This uncertainty shaped how the story was told. Some framed the Follings as exploiters who took advantage of vulnerable children and an indifferent system. Others insisted they were merely products of their time, operating within social norms that no longer exist. Still others suggested something darker, something deliberate, though no one could agree on what that might have been. Each interpretation said as much about the storyteller as it did about the past. In the absence of facts, meaning filled the void. The children themselves, if any survived into adulthood, left no confirmed trace. No marriage licenses linked them to new families. No employment records tied them to specific towns. No obituaries carried their names. This absence invited speculation that some may have reinvented themselves, choosing anonymity as a form of survival. Others believed the lack of records pointed to earlier ends. The truth, hidden by time and silence, resisted every attempt at certainty. What unsettled later generations most was the realization that nothing definitively stopped the Follings. There was no moment of exposure, no confrontation that forced clarity. The story ended not with justice or revelation, but with quiet dissolution. The family aged, moved, or died, and with them went whatever knowledge they possessed. The unanswered questions were not erased, only abandoned. This lack of closure challenged the comforting belief that history always corrects itself. In academic circles, the case became an example of systemic failure rather than individual anomaly. It illustrated how lives could be erased not through violence alone, but through neglect, indifference, and bureaucratic gaps. The uncertainty was not accidental. It was produced by a world that valued order over inquiry and familiarity over accountability. The children became symbols of those who lived and vanished within that world, unseen by the mechanisms meant to protect them. Community memory proved just as unreliable as official records. Stories shifted over time, growing more dramatic or more dismissive, depending on who told them. Details changed, motives were reassigned. The absence of fixed facts allowed the narrative to be reshaped endlessly. What remained constant was the discomfort. Even those who downplayed the story acknowledged that something about it felt unresolved, as though a chapter had been torn from a book and never replaced. This uncertainty also raised difficult ethical questions about remembrance. How does one honor lives that cannot be fully named or verified? How does one mourn without graves, dates, or certainty of death? The children of the Follings existed in a historical limbo that resisted traditional forms of recognition. Remembering them required acknowledging gaps, accepting ambiguity, and resisting the urge to simplify their story into something more manageable. The legacy of the Follings is not confined to their household or their time. It echoes in modern discussions about undocumented children, informal guardianship, and institutional responsibility. The past refuses to stay contained when its lessons remain unresolved. Each unanswered question becomes a warning, reminding later generations how easily systems can fail when accountability is diffuse and compassion is assumed rather than verified. What ultimately endures is not a definitive conclusion, but a persistent unease that settles over the story like a shadow. The Follings did not leave behind a confession or a defense, only absence layered upon absence. The children remain unidentified, their paths untraced, their voices unheard. History offers no final judgment, only the unsettling recognition that certainty was never guaranteed, and that entire lives can pass through the world leaving behind nothing solid enough to prove they were ever truly seen.